I'm very pleased on behalf of the Nanda Center for International and Comparative Law at the University of Denver, Sturm College of Law, of which I'm the secretary. Very pleased to be able to welcome you to this important program, the 2016 Conference on Tibet, Rights, Reality, and the Law. My name is Catherine Nanda, and I'm going to be just introducing the key facets of the program. Excuse me. The program is being sponsored by the Tibetan Centre on Human Rights and Democracy, the Korbel School for International Studies, the Center on Rights Development at the Korbel School, the International Law Society at the University of Denver College of Law, and the Nanda Center. Did I miss anyone? Did I miss anyone? Any of the co-sponsors? I think I've got everybody. And we're very grateful to them for their participation. And I would like to introduce to you the instigator of this program, who is an old friend, and that is Mr. John Gaudette, who is a legal research officer at the Tibetan Centre for Human Rights and Democracy, which I mentioned, in Dharamshala, India. He's been there for three years. He had gotten his MA at the Korbel School and his JD from the law school, graduated in 2012. So this was his first job right out of law school. And he's doing a beautiful job there, and we're very, very, very pleased that he brought his concept for this program here. And he was a member of the Jessup Moot Court competition team while he was here at the law school. And I think that that's all that I have to say, but simply to tell you that there will be two panels. The first panel will focus on the situation in Tibet and the relationship between China and Tibet and how it affects the people of Tibet and their lives and their freedom. And the second panel will focus on international implications of that situation and that relationship. So I would like to introduce to you John Gaudette, who will be moderating the first panel, and welcoming John Gaudette.
Thank you, Catherine. Can everyone hear me on the microphone, or how's this?
That's good.
Okay. So, thank you for the nice introduction, and you may have noticed Galen is stuck in traffic coming down from Boulder. So at some point he'll show up, and he's going to be speaking, sorry, I have my eye on the door, I'll stop doing that. He's going to be speaking about the Chinese policies and how they're impacting Nepal's policies towards Tibetans. And Dukthen is going to be talking about the Tibetan self-immolations and how that has worked. And I'll be a bit of a catch-all because there are a lot of issues and we want to touch on as many as possible. Then if you guys have questions or anything else, we can go into more depth. So,
Sure.
Okay, so without further ado, this is Dukthen. She is a master's student at Korbel and is much more familiar with Tibetan issues than I am. So she's the resident expert, we can say.
And good evening to all. Thank you so much for coming and joining us on for this discussion on Tibet. My name is Dukthen Kyi. I'm a Tibetan. I was born in Tibet, but then I left when I was around 5 to India. Like thousands of Tibetans have done. I crossed over the Himalayas for weeks and about a month actually, and then I reached Nepal and then Dharamsala in India. But I have very vague memory of my journey because I was very young at the time. Generally, actually until 2008, every year nearly 2,500 Tibetans make this journey of crossing the Himalaya and reaching Nepal and India, coming in exile, searching for freedom, to meet the Dalai Lama, and to get a better education. But after 2008, the number dropped sharply. Only about 600 to 700 Tibetans have made so far to come in exile every year. So what happened in 2008? If you may remember, 2008 was the year that China hosted the Beijing Olympic. That was in April. But 2008 was also when we saw a historic uprising in Tibet, mostly of the recent time. So starting from February, there were a number of protests, different in size and at different places throughout Tibet. If I'm not wrong, about 300 or more such protests took place around Tibet. The protests were mostly spontaneous. All of a sudden, you hear about a protest going on in Lhasa, and then from the other side of Tibet, people started to come out on the street and protest as well. The protest was one of the biggest one, if you may consider, of recent time. There was the failed national uprising that happened in 1959, and later on in the late 1980s, there were another mass protest in Tibet, but that also failed. And the 2008 uprising was one of those categories. And during this protest, it's actually quite funny that it started with, from the reports that we have heard in exile, it started off with a child going to buy a balloon, I'm assuming probably from a Chinese seller, but then before he could get hold of the rope, the thread, it flew off, and the seller said, "You have to pay for it." And then other Tibetans who saw this backed up the little kid and said, "You cannot do that." And then it started on. There were more Tibetans who came and supported the few Tibetans who were supporting this young kid. There was one report that we heard in exile about maybe one of the first one that started in that year. And then it would be of different reasons, but then it started everywhere around Tibet. So as the protest went on, in the end, at least 7,000 Tibetans were arrested or detained for being part of the uprising. Nearly 600 are known to have been sentenced to prison terms from less than a year to life, and 7 were sentenced to death. Then comes 2009, when a young monk in his early 20s, came down on the street of Ngaba, which is one of the most restive region in Tibet, and carrying a Tibetan flag, national flag, the one that looked like this one. He ran on the street shouting slogans, and he was on fire. Excuse me. So that was the first of the self-immolation protests that happened in Tibet. And since then, since 2011, 146 more Tibetans have self-immolated. Five of those happened in exile in Nepal and India, and at least 125 of them are known to have died. We don't know the situation of the rest. Almost all of the self-immolators, they were calling for freedom in Tibet, human rights in Tibet, and the return of the Dalai Lama to Tibet. After the it's still ongoing. The most recent one happened last year in August, if I'm not wrong. And the self-immolators, you can see, were people from different walks of life. They included mother of 3 young kids, monks, nuns. So they range from like early teenagers to older people in their 60s or early 60s. So from this we could see that it was not just a problem of one family or something. And looking at what happened after the self-immolations, as soon as a self-immolation takes place, the local So usually, like right after self-immolation, the local authorities or the police would take away the person who self-immolated if he or she was alive, or they would even take away the body, so that the family or the monastery or the nunnery would not be able to perform the last rites and rituals for the deceased. That is another way to hurt the sentiments of the people. And in fact, the first monk, his name is Chape. We still don't know what happened with him. So when he was on fire, the local police actually shot at him. And in more recent time, the Chinese authorities, they tried to criminalize self-immolation. At least 98 Tibetans are known to have been arrested or sentenced or have disappeared for allegedly having association with the self-immolators. It might, there were actually no proof that those Tibetans who were arrested and sentenced had any link or knew the self-immolator before the incident happened. So they were often those who were onlookers, but then who tried to capture pictures and send the information outside Tibet because they didn't want the protests to go in vain. They knew what they were getting into, but they wanted the word to get out, to tell what is happening inside Tibet. And the 98 people who have been arrested and sentenced, their sentence range from different ages, different terms, like from 1 year's sentence term to 13 to death sentence also. So what did the Chinese government do? They have only responded with intensified repression. The Tibetan protesters, they were asking for religious freedom, for being able to learn their own language and practice it. And there were also nomads who took this drastic action of self-immolating themselves, and that maybe John would talk about later, the mass removal and relocation of nomads from their own area and putting them in concrete buildings, so they don't know what to do with their life because they have been practicing and have been a nomad for generations and all their lives. Yeah, so maybe I should stop here and then John can take over. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take a bit of a step back and look at China's policies in general. And the important thing about Tibet is that you have to keep in mind that it's a systemic repression that's going on. The policies aren't being, or human rights are not being violated by occasional governors or individual officials or police officers, but it's actually policies. And these policies are overarching, and they impact almost every level of people's life depending on where they live. So in places like Driru, which is in the Tibet Autonomous Region, Tibetans in that town were told they had to fly Chinese flags on the tops of buildings. And that's a forced display of patriotism that's not expected anywhere else in the PRC. And they responded by tearing up the flags and throwing them into the river. And because of that, they've been subject to repeated re-education campaigns. The travel out of there has been subject to roadblocks. And so I'm going to focus on a few broad areas where Chinese policies have been very clear. We either have documents that show it's Chinese policies or just how the system works. And I'm going to focus on three major areas, and then in the questions, if there's anything else you're interested in, we'd be happy to talk about that. I'm going to talk about surveillance and how that ties into policies of collective punishment, the environment, which includes the resettlement of the nomads, and the detention process that Tibetans face when they're detained. So starting with surveillance, I think most of us, when we think about surveillance today, we think about high-tech surveillance, and particularly with Apple saying they weren't going to give a backdoor to the US government, that's fresh on people's minds. But in China, what they have is they've taken advantage of the fact that there are about 6.4 million Tibetans compared to, I think it's 1.3 billion Chinese. And the Chinese security state has more funding and more support than its military, which you can put into context when we think about the South China Sea and how China has been increasing its military spending. It's still outpaced and less than what they spend on domestic security. And per capita, they spend more in the Tibet Autonomous Region than anywhere else in the PRC. So what they do is they have brute force policies, which includes educate the masses and mass line policies, where Chinese officials literally move into villages and are responsible for a few households. And their job is to make sure that those households do not step out of line. And if they do, it's not just the person who did whatever the Chinese didn't like that gets in trouble, but it's the entire community. We know this because we received a document from Tibet where they announced explicitly that if there was a self-immolation in a town, the entire town would be responsible. People would lose their rights to harvest caterpillar fungus, which is a main source of their livelihood. They would lose their rights to work for the government. All their bank loans, including their house, would be called up. In monasteries and places like that, communities were forced to make a down payment, essentially a ransom. And if there was a self-immolation, they'd take that money and demand another payment. And these are all methods of trying to address people exercising their human rights, be it extreme like the self-immolations, where it's freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, or even solo protests, which have increased a lot more, where the solo protesters walk down the street shouting slogans and are very quickly beaten up and arrested. And so there's the mass line policy where it's a brute force approach of the number of people who are involved. And then on top of that, there is internet surveillance. So we've seen numerous examples of Tibetans who are arrested because they have banned information on WeChat. And banned information can include anything from teachings about the teachings of the Dalai Lamas, or flags, or slogans, or almost anything depending on how things work. And usually the people who are arrested, the police come in the dead of night and they take them out of the monastery or their homes quietly and usually with overwhelming force. So with the environment, there's another set of policies which China claims are designed to protect the environment, but have actually done very little. Tibet is one of the most rural places in the world, and that means that there are real problems for providing, health, education, and basic services like that. The Chinese have addressed this not by looking at how other rural communities have addressed the problem, for example, Australia, but they've addressed it by forcing Tibetans to resettle. So these are nomads who have lived off the land and on the land for their entire lives and for generations, in some cases thousands of years. And they've been taken off the grasslands ostensibly to protect them. The consequence of this policy, though, is that the yaks and the animals that have kept the grass at bay aren't there, and it upsets the ecosystem. And the Tibetan nomads are then forced to resettle into fairly stoic housing, I guess you could call it. It's a concrete bunker in most cases with limited heat, limited housing, and no space, which means the nomads have to sell off their entire herds. And on top of that, the nomads are promised a small payment, and that doesn't always happen. And even when they do get a payment, it's offset by them now having to pay for housing, they have to pay for rent, they have to pay for heating. And in some cases, the Tibetans who have been resettled are unable to afford heating. And these policies, and then fairly misguided policies then to further protect the environment by trying to plant trees and crops that they've exercised policies that are inappropriate for the Tibetan plateau. And compounding this is also that the Chinese have been mining. And in some cases, Tibetans have been kicked off the land, and the land has been called a natural reserve, and then it's been opened up for mining a few weeks later. And in some cases, mining has been used as a threat to a local community. In one case, a local, I think it was mayor in a township, said that if people didn't stop protesting, he'd open up a local sacred mountain for mining. Other cases, stupas and sacred objects have been destroyed. And unsurprisingly, what happens when the Chinese exercise these harsh policies is that Tibetans protest. It creates a cycle. And when Tibetans protest, they get detained initially. And the detention is not a formal arrest. And the Chinese criminal law allows for secret detention, or something that euphemistically sounds a bit like house arrest. But in cases of state security, which includes anything involving Tibet, people are put into a secret detention site. Their family doesn't know where they are. Their lawyer can't access them. And there's no information about what happens. And that's when they're most likely to be tortured and treated the worst. And after that is a formal arrest. And the formal arrest is then they're detained, they're not necessarily beaten, but they're not put in good conditions. They're usually denied medical care and put on a starvation diet. And then after the formal arrest is prison. China has a 99.9% conviction rate, I think. And for political crimes, it's even higher. And we've gotten copies of court opinions from Chinese courts that are 2 pages long and say that people are sentenced to 7 and 15 years in prison for putting captions on a photo that's shared on WeChat. And then in detention, the conditions can vary. But generally, denial of medical care is common. Forced labor is common. And that's frequently coupled with beatings, particularly if people speak up for Tibet or challenge Chinese propaganda. And because of these conditions, in 2014, there was a massive increase in the number of deaths in detention. So from 2009 to 2014, there had been 18 deaths in detention. In 2014, there were 10. In 2015, there have been 3 that we're aware of, including the death of Tenzin Delek Rinpoche, who was somebody that was under international scrutiny, and the international community was following his case. And he'd been denied medical care, he'd been put in a cell that had sub-freezing temperatures, and eventually he succumbed to his treatment. So, unfortunately, that's not a happy note, but I'll stop now and hand off to Galen, who has succeeded in battling the traffic down.
Thank you, John, and I apologize sincerely for being so late here. I was coming not only from Boulder, where I live, but a bit above Boulder in the town of Gold Hill at a parent-teacher conference at my son's school, and that added an extra half hour. And traffic on I-25 was bad, and then university was brutal. So I apologize that I missed the first section. And I have a couple notes here that I tried to print out, but it's been a bit of a scramble all today. So, I want to, I guess, introduce myself. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Colorado up in Boulder in the Department of Geography. And my course of study right now, or the thrust of my dissertation, is Chinese investment and development in Nepal, and the way that plays out socioculturally and politically and economically as China assumes an expanded role in not just Nepal and Kathmandu and politics there, but more broadly in South Asia. I've been working and studying in Nepal and in the Tibetan Plateau for about 16 years, since I was an undergrad in 1998, and I've seen a dramatic transformation in the treatment of and conditions for Tibetan exiles, as well as other groups, but particularly Tibetan. So I thought the theme of my bit of the talk here could be mobility, assembly, and identity, or the cultural politics for Tibetans in exile. So I have been both in Nepal and the Tibetan Plateau in the past year, and I'm not sure if we talked about it already. I apologize for missing it, but just this year, or just this month, Tibet's again been closed to foreigners. And it tends to happen on a yearly cycle as we get close to Losar, the New Year, and Tibetan Uprising Day on March 10th. In the context of that, this closure in real hold and constraints on the Tibet Autonomous Region and other Tibetan prefectures in China, I want to look back to 2008 and sort of look at a timeline from 2008 to 2016 now, and the trajectory for Tibetans in Chinese politics in Nepal. So in 2008, there were dramatic and fairly unprecedentedly violent protests in Lhasa. My girlfriend at the time and partner now had been teaching English in Lhasa that winter, and we were on a trip at the time in northern India and then in Kathmandu, staying with some of my Tibetan friends. And then we intended to go back to Lhasa so she could resume her studies. I was doing some work for my master's degree. I also went to an IR school on the East Coast, the Fletcher School, so I have a background in IR and international politics as well. We weren't able to get there. We went to Chengdu, we went up to Chining, the major cities and access points into the TAR. Everything was closed. The riots occurred, Tibet was locked down. Subsequently, it was the year of the Olympics in Beijing, of course. The protests occurred on a global scale, but particularly at the base camp of Mount Everest, the Students for Free Tibet protest. Not much in Lhasa, but hyper-concerned paranoia for the Chinese Communist Party, and the perception that this threat to the state was really growing and exploded, which in ways it was. The subsequent crackdown was met with one of the more powerful but also tragic forms of protest that we've witnessed on the Tibetan Plateau in decades, and that was the escalation of self-immolations. A pretty negative feedback loop in that one form of protest perpetuates a state response that forms another form of protest, and this continued to cycle for a number of years. In 2008, I was unable to get to Tibet. I returned to Nepal in 2009, doing master's research, and was able to get there. And both the TAR was in Lhasa was unlike what I'd seen before. And I'd been there in March of 1999, which was the 50th anniversary of Uprising Day. And state control then was significant, prominent, ubiquitous, omnipresent. And in 2009, it was even greater. And I'd say that last year, when I was there in 2015, it had ratcheted up even further. The conditions in Tibet also seem to have, or not seem, quite literally have, flown downstream or down the roads into Nepal as well. In two ways, as John may have spoken to, a significant reduction in the numbers of Tibetan refugees who have left Tibet, and the unprecedented restrictions on mobility and assembly and speech for Tibetans in exile. When I was back in Kathmandu in 2009, it was soon after the erstwhile Tibetan embassy, or the Central Tibet Administration's mission to Kathmandu, had been closed, shuttered, and actually the chiefs of mission there had been more or less run out of town. A couple informants of mine had left with their families in night and fled to southern India to get as far away as what they felt was Chinese pressure as they possibly could, and where they, of course, had extended family in some of the refugee camps. The Tibetan administration has more of a presence now, 7-8 years down the road in Kathmandu, but it's still even more marginalized than it had been prior to 2008. And we're already talking about a very marginal community that doesn't have the de jure status of state citizenship recognition such as that. So where are we today? Currently in Kathmandu, there's a culture that has developed in the Tibetan communities, both in Gaudette and Swayambhu, and some of the Tibetan refugee camps in Jualakhel, outside of Kathmandu, and Pokhara, elsewhere, of self-surveillance. And for those of us that have read a little bit of Foucault, which I'm not so bold as to delve into, but you see a form of governmentality occurring where there's control over the conduct of conduct. And Tibetans are self-policing, self-surveilling one another. There's a whole conversation going on about Chinese surveillance, closed-circuit television or video cameras, spies that are Tibetans but on the dole of the Chinese government. A real pervasive form of paranoia, which again creates these negative feedback loops such that people won't talk about the things that they used to talk about, which is Ramzen, which is self-determination, which is autonomy, middle way, other forms of political struggle. There's unwritten rules that are adhered to closely and strictly by the Tibetan community of not congregating in significant groups, not celebrating large public holidays. Losar is not celebrated publicly at the major stupas anymore. Tibetan Uprising Day certainly is not. His Holiness's birthday is not. Some of these were cultural, were directives from Dharamsala years past when the immolations were at their height. Public Losar and celebrations for His Holiness's birthday were suspended as a form of respect and in mourning of the martyrs of the immolations. However, that has evolved into an unknown, unspoken, and unwritten law and prohibition that's coming down from the Nepali government over Tibetan populations. Where and why does that exist? China in the late 90s set a new policy and campaign, Shuba de Kaifa, to open up the West. That was in Xinjiang and Tibet primarily. In about 5 years ago, they expanded that into the One Belt, One Road policy, or the Silk Road Economic Belt and Silk Maritime Road. That is an extension of Chinese infrastructure, economic policy, growth, and what goes with that political leverage and power over China's borders into Laos, Burma, or Myanmar, Nepal, Pakistan, Afghanistan. You can make a ring around China, and it's the case all through. So as China invests heavily, builds roads, floods markets with new goods, invests foreign direct investment at unprecedented scale, that evolves into new political leverage that Beijing maintains and holds and wields in foreign capitals. That, in my view, is how Beijing has attained and maintains such political power in Kathmandu that's increasingly used for and against the mobility and voice of the Tibetan population there. I think I'm out of time, but I hope that we have a bit for Q&A, and I'll leave it at there. Thank you.
So I think we'll take a break now, and we'll have a general panel Q&A when everyone has finished speaking. So that.
And the break is going to be simply stand up and sit down. And if you need some glass of water or something, we might do that. And I'm going to request my both colleagues to come in so that we can all then, afterwards, 6 of us can sit down and take questions and answers.
So I'll just call the second panel to order. See, like he said, we keep our word. Stand up and sit down. So I'm calling the second panel to order then. And this is going to be Professor Ved Nanda from the College of Law, Professor Claude D'Estree from the Center on Rights Development and Korbel School, and Professor Gilbert from the Korbel School. And gentlemen. and Professor Nanda will chair. I have it on good authority.
So delighted to be with you, and it's a creme de la creme. It's not the quantity but quality, and wonderful to have you here. It will be very short kind of presentations. Maybe each one of us will take about 10 to 12 minutes, and then I think all 6 of us can sit here and not simply questions, answers, but we can have any comments that you would like to ask. I'm delighted, honored to have 2 exceptionally talented and wonderful colleagues here. And I know that one of my colleagues, Alan, is on sabbatical and still took the time to join us. And Claude has been so busy, but still he is able to take the time to come. But at the same time, I'm deeply, deeply grateful to you because the classes are going on, everyone is busy, and still you're here. One person that I especially want to recognize is Anna Gary. Anne, would you stand up? She's the coordinator of the Nanda Center and put the program together. And again, I'm deeply grateful to the International Law Society, the Nanda Center, and wonderful colleagues at the Center on Rights Development at Korbel. The first person to speak today, I'm deeply honored and privileged to present him to you, is a person who for 35 years has been actively working on this Tibet-China issues and working in a very important capacity, because he's the one who was initiated by His Holiness Dalai Lama. He has been involved in the Buddhism, creating awareness of it, teaching it, and has been deeply involved in all that has happened in Tibet with Dalai Lama, with China. He is a chaplain here. He started, and I was very honored to be with me here at the Sturm College of Law, currently at Korbel, directing their center and also teaching in the human rights area and in genocide and many areas pertaining to international law and human rights for many years. A scholar, a teacher, an activist, a practitioner. Kindly join me in welcoming Claude D'Estree. And Claude, after all that introduction, you have just about 10 to 12 minutes.
I thought after Ved's normal introductions, anything that starts off as 10, 12 minutes, it was reduced usually to 5. I would like to first actually start, how I'm going to do it, by acknowledging the courage of Dukthen Kyi to talk about self-immolators. It's something that I would have a very difficult time talking about. I can't imagine you doing that. It's also hard to really grasp what that means. Not just for anyone to do that, but within the framework of being a practicing Buddhist, to take that extraordinary measure to commit suicide in such a fashion, one that is, by any account, painful beyond belief, and in some senses in violation of everything that is held dear. So it is an act of desperation, for both the individual, but also an act of desperation because the individual is watching and experiencing that everything that they love the most is dying before them. Back in 1959, when international jurists started considering or considered whether or not genocide took place in Tibet, they came up with a kind of a curious formulation that basically came up with this kind of a concept of cultural genocide, because they noted that religious genocide had taken place, but maybe not national or not the people themselves, although I found that to be an interesting separation. Of course, the international community didn't do anything or hardly recognized that. And since that point, I've found it fascinating. We've had long discussions about genocide in the world, and seemingly always forget to go back to one of the earlier ones in the 20th century. We sort of skip over Tibet. We talk about the Holocaust and that genocide and other genocides, and skip this very important one. Perhaps because Tibet didn't have anything we wanted. Didn't have oil, as amongst other things. So I'm not sure what you call it when you lose a quarter of the population and 90% of the monasteries. I call it genocide. I still do not know, after all these years, why the rest of the world does not acknowledge that. I began working on issues of Tibet-China relations, or issues of that actually, when I became a Dharma student very early in life, and then being much more active in the 1970s when Tibetan teachers started to come to the United States. I was fortunate to start working with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in 1979 when he first came to the United States, finally got permission to come to the United States, and hosted him when I was a young graduate student at Harvard Divinity School, and have worked with him since. As Ved noted, I was appointed as the first Buddhist Chaplain to Harvard University by His Holiness. I had also the very good fortune then to be able to work not just to learning how to be a Dharma teacher, but also to be politically active and what it meant, and to be involved in trying to get the world to understand what was going on in Tibet. Skip ahead many years and work, but I handed out something, because obviously I was joking with Ved, as a professor you can't go someplace and not kill trees, so I had to hand out some documents for you to look at, because I think that these are important documents that anyone who has an interest in the relationship between Tibet and China should be at least familiar with this small group of documents that begins with the formulation of the Middle Way, Five-Point Peace Plan, the Strasbourg Proposal, and the Strasbourg Speech. As a young man, I found myself being able to work with a remarkable group of people, both Westerners and Tibetans, and was with His Holiness working on the crafting of the Middle Way, and especially adding my thoughts to the Five-Point Peace Plan and the crafting of the Strasbourg Proposal. So these are important documents for me, both personally, but in terms of understanding what His Holiness and the Tibetan people in exile are trying to do. The Middle Way, very basically, is simple. I'm not going to overly reduce it, which is to say His Holiness was not, it was very controversial, obviously, even to this day within the Tibetan community, saying we're not seeking independence, we're seeking to be truly autonomous. Autonomy within international law has very specific requirements. And from my perspective, I was simply thought that maybe if we could simply demand from Beijing that they actually abide by the law as to what constitutes autonomy. Now, the other piece, of course, is the TAR, and it's interesting how we do that. We've reduced people to an acronym, the TAR, because partially maybe that's useful, because those of us who do this work know that the TAR is not Tibet. The TAR is what is left of Tibet, and big chunks of what is traditionally known as Tibet have simply been brought in to the larger Chinese nation. But he recognized that maybe that was inevitable, that the ability to ask for real independence was already gone, that train had left the station. So how do we achieve true autonomy? And a clear indication to the Chinese that they will continue to handle foreign policy and security, but that the Tibetan people ought to be fully autonomous within that structure. We could have a whole other discussion about the movement of autonomous regions in the world, because that's an interesting movement in and of itself, something I've been interested in for 20 years, how that's working, so that, if you wish, the host state recognizing that they're having difficulties, if you wish, with a certain nationality within their borders and trying to work that out. Spain is going through that, and lots of other kinds of countries are doing so. But there's no standard by which we understand how an autonomous region is supposed to function. So it wasn't about independence, it was about being truly autonomous. I think it's important, going back to this sense of genocide, because I don't think that the International Commission of Jurists understood when they said, well, that we recognize this kind of cultural or religious genocide is taking place, but not a national genocide. Well, there's a problem here, because the word for being Tibetan is the same word for being Buddhist, basically. You cannot take away Buddhism and have anything left that you can call Tibetan. So what if you take away Buddhism and you take away the structure of that, you take away the monastic tradition, you take away the temples and the monasteries and the art and the teachings, and you try to strip a people of that, especially the Tibetans, you're not left with anyone, right? You're left with a people who live in a particular plateau, but who can't even call themselves Tibetans anymore, because the self-identification is cellular, right? Is in the bones. It's not something you simply adopt and decide to be something else, right? It's certainly true there are other minorities in Tibet. There are Muslims and others as well. But it's very hard in this culture to fathom that relationship, that symbiotic relationship between being a Buddhist and being a Tibetan. The 5-point peace plan that was brought, I remember it was interesting. I brought back memories even going through the document once again and going through Congress, because this is a presentation he made to Congress, and I was with His Holiness walking through the halls of Congress and trying to drum up support. It was really straightforward. The first one is transformation of the whole of Tibet into a zone of peace, a peace zone. Right? And one of the things that he always had noticed is that China and India didn't start to have serious conflicts until China invaded and took over Tibet, and they had wound up with a shared border. The conflicts, the physical conflicts, really started. There were obviously political conflicts, but the kind of firefights that actually continue to happen to this day between Chinese and Indian troops only started after China invaded Tibet, and they had a common border. So His Holiness wanted a peace zone, a border, a buffer zone. We understand, and any nation who has been invaded and has gone through as many kinds of warfare over the many millennium as China has, wants to create a buffer zone. The Russians have done that. They continue to want to do that. That's, Putin's desire to have Ukraine and Crimea and whatnot, to have a greater Russia, is really not so much to have a greater Russia, but to have a bigger buffer zone for Mother Russia, right? China wants to do the same thing too. You get that, you understand that, you can almost appreciate that. But it's honest to say, well, we can offer you that buffer zone, but just, let us be who we are. The second one, which is the one that I worked on the most for many decades, was the abandonment of China's population transfer policy, which threatens the very existence of the Tibetans as a people. That, by the way, in itself is, as folks up here know, and many of you know, that is a gross violation of international law, is population transfer, the process of population transfer. Tibetans have become a minority in their own country. Lhasa is almost unrecognizable. If you go to Lhasa, I have not been to Lhasa, I've been designated as part of the Dalai Lama's clique. I couldn't get in if my life depended upon it. But I've seen plenty of pictures at this point, and lots of conversations with people, and what has happened is that the structure, all these wonderful things that the Chinese, by the way, I should back up. I tend to think of this is a Han-Tibet conflict, not a China-Tibet conflict. Maybe we can talk about that a little bit later. And there's a significant difference, I think. at least in my mind and some of us who do this work. But all these great improvements that Beijing and the Han said they were going to bring to Tibet and to Lhasa, they brought in, the population transfer took place, and they brought in all these wonderful things like hospitals and clinics and education and power lines and you know, and if you were to look, it all goes to the Chinese population in Lhasa. And the Tibetans have not had any, I don't think, from the disparity between the Tibetan population and the Han population in Lhasa, it tells an incredible picture, story about what the intent was. The third one was respect for Tibetan people's fundamental human rights. The fourth, the restoration and protection of Tibet's natural environment. I think that was raised already. The stripping of all the natural resources and what is happening to the river system in Tibet, which is, of course, is freaking out the Indians downriver, and the long-term effects, the natural disaster that is already in the making and will just get much worse. We'll watch that, and I think this is a deep concern to the Indian government, how that's going to affect. And if you want to see further conflict, armed conflict between India and China is when this process is exacerbated because of the stripping of timber and lots of other resources. And then the last one is negotiations. That my dear friend and colleague, Lodi Giri, spent his entire career as His Holiness's special envoy in 9 rounds of completely and absolutely fruitless discussion with the Beijing government. It was political theater, either depending on your viewpoint at its best or it's its worst. And he's recently retired, and I can't begin to tell you the kind of public service that man gave to the Tibetan people at some cost. With my 1 minute left, and we should talk about this further, I am really more concerned at this point, something that we don't like to talk about, and I say we, I'm not Tibetan, but the Tibetan community doesn't like to talk about is what happens after His Holiness dies. What happens to the Tibetan community? What happens to that process, that work that has gone on for a very long time to try to have some kind of rapprochement with the Beijing government? You know, I've been part of that community for a long time, not as an intimate member, that's not possible, but as an observer for a very long time. I was there. I was telling Dukthen I was there when the young Tibetans started looking at Yasser Arafat as a hero, and wanted to go in that direction. And His Holiness said, trying to create a democratic institution, said, "Fine, we can vote to do that, but if you say that's how we're going to go, you can do that. But I'm going to resign as Dalai Lama," which of course stops the whole process within the Tibetan community immediately. But the seeds are still there. The seeds of the old sort of Kampa warrior sensibilities. The seed, not just the seeds, but some of you may not, some of you know about Establishment 22, or the special forces that have been trained for many decades. Tibetans were sort of like the Gurkhas, very much like the Gurkhas in terms of being trained to be elite fighters in the mountains and to survive off of the land. I've talked to these men many generations. They talk openly within the community about having caches of arms, not just there, but actually throughout the Tibetan plateau, and saying, you know, without His Holiness there, they are ready to start up an armed insurrection, a guerrilla insurrection against the Chinese infrastructure. I have no idea if this would be complete disaster and they'd be completely slaughtered, or they would actually carry out a long-term violent process. I'm actually very deeply disappointed in the maturity of that ancient culture called China, that they don't recognize that the short-term myopic view of the Dalai Lama is will really hurt them, desperately hurt them in the long run. Because His Holiness is this, not just a unifying force amongst the Tibetans and keeping that community together, which I value, but he's also the person who has kept peace in that part of the world in ways I don't think Beijing comprehends or understands. So maybe if we have a chance a little later, we can have a conversation with the other panelists as well about where this goes. His Holiness is 80. I know the Tibetans all think he's going to live to 120. I would love him to do so too, but that's not a reality. So time is running out. Time is really running out for a solution. But as we heard from our previous panel, it's not getting better, it's getting worse. So I'd love to end on a positive note, but I can't.
Not a positive note, but an authoritative voice. And I am deeply grateful to you for taking the time and sharing with us your own thinking. And that's very valuable to all of us to learn. The next speaker today is again my very close, dear friend, colleague, Alan Gilbert. And Alan is university professor, as you probably know, only one person a year out of 500, 600, or 800 faculty would be selected as Evans Professor. And with his effort, that name will not stay too long. And that has been his effort and his initiative. As he walked in, I mentioned to him that he has been so busy in not simply his own scholarly research. And when Alan became the university professor, being on that committee, I had brought to the attention of my own colleagues, which they saw, that throughout not the United States, but internationally, he is considered one of the major scholars in his own field. And along with that, he has been very gracious. For many years, he has been taking students to Dharamshala, and he has been following all that's happening. And despite all this introduction, and there is much more, Alan has also got only about 10 to 12 minutes.
I do lead a group of students to go to Tibet, or rather Dharamsala, but you can get the spirit of compassion in spite of all, which is very hopeful, which radiates from Tibet. And so that's in the winter. So anybody who might be interested, please come see me or write to me. This is a very deep topic, and I want to start out with a couple of points, both of which could exhaust a fair amount of time. But Colorado was founded on the Sand Creek Massacre of Cheyennes and Arapahoes. The sainted John Evans did more to provoke that massacre and was fired for it in 1865 than any other single person except John Chivington, also on the original board of trustees of the University of Denver, who carried it out. When we talk about what has happened with Tibetans, or I will speak as a Jew, when we talk about what has happened to Palestinians in the occupied territories by Israel, we talk about a process of ethnic cleansing or genocide. And the mirror is precise, and if you look at Tibet as if it's far away, you make a mistake, because it's right here. Settler colonialism. I'll just say one word about this, actually. Hitler read these Indian novels by a fellow named Karl May. He was the J.K. Rowling of Germany. He's still read 100 years later. People identify with the Apache leader Winnetou. Hitler did Cowboys and Indians, and he read the whole Karl May series, 70 books, after he took power. And he referred to the Russians as Redskins. I learned this a year ago. The term for the eastern territories conquered by Germany in World War II was the Wild East. And America has been in the leadership of shutting that down so that nobody will understand that what was done right here and all across the country was all about what Hannah Arendt called the boomerang effect, what Hitler brought to Europe. We're not talking about less developed countries and foreign territories. We are talking about the center of what is evil in international politics, and a lot of what is evil right here in this country, because this country was based on several genocides of black people, many people realize, but if you ask why there ain't no Rapahos in Arapahoe County, you ask yourself that. Or on Arapahoe Road, you will get really sharply what the problem is. So this is one basic point. A second basic point is that there is Tibetan resistance. And I want to emphasize it. It was mentioned before, about 2009. But I want to say just briefly, Claude is of course right in a certain way about self-immolation. But Thich Nhat Hanh wrote about it because his teacher friend Thich Quang Duc burned himself in Saigon to protest the US-sponsored Diem regime in Saigon, which outlawed the celebration of Buddha's birthday and made Christmas the national holiday in Vietnam, South Vietnam, it being 10% Catholic. And Diem was brought down by that self-immolation and the protest which emerged about it. And Thich Nhat Hanh has a long discussion of the Lotus Sutra, and in the 25th chapter he discusses the Medicine King Buddha, who did this kind of self-sacrifice, and occasionally the Dalai Lama refers to it. And it is beyond what most of us, and I agree with Claude, can take in. But on the other hand, it is a very profound form of political protest, public protest. Sometimes to great effect, sometimes. So I want to talk about the Dalai Lama as a political as well as spiritual leader. And I think that Plato's notion of a philosopher king is meant as a satire in the Republic. So I will say that all of those neocons who wish we would have George Bush the right man or one or another philosopher king are a bunch of crazy people. But if there is a philosopher king in this universe, it's probably the Dalai Lama. And if you hang out around Dharamsala, there are no Tibetans who beg. And the United States has been a fitful supporter of the Tibetans against the Chinese regime, training people to fight at Camp Hale here in Colorado until the agreement with Mao during the Nixon period. But the Dalai Lama has used the support of many, many people in the world, including the American government, to build up a great resource like the Tibetan Children's Village to protect Tibetans, and to preserve the culture there. And the culture is disseminated here. So there are a large number of Tibetans, including Lopon Rinpoche, who taught me some Tibetan, in Boulder. And the seeds have been spread. You know of Naropa, right? I mean, I must have heard of it. It's gotten around. And this is an important point about Tibetan Buddhism. The middle way is a very wise strategy for China, not just for the Dalai Lama, who wants to preserve Tibetan religion and culture and is willing to go very far to do that. And I want to say something about why it's a wise strategy for China, because it's easy, given the horrors of what the Chinese have done there and American propaganda, to have the view that the Chinese are a very dangerous group. If you look at the map and you step back from the identity of the different powers, imagine that after 100 years of colonialism, your power had fought free and somebody took over and armed, as Spain did for a while, South Florida against the new regime. Probably be pretty upset with Spain. If you think about Taiwan, which is on the border of China, funded by the United States, you'll get an idea. They are occupying Staten Island or the south of Florida. There have been two major wars waged there. Korea, we still have 50,000 troops there, and Vietnam, right near China. It would be as if from Mexico and Canada there had been large invasions of the Chinese. And if that were the case, the Chinese bogey person conjured in the American media with a big dollop of racism in it, you know, might be real. But when the Chinese say that American military activity is dangerous, including Barack Obama, you may know that we're flying over there and we got fleets in the area because we're protecting for Japan and the Philippines, claims because the Chinese are building up certain islands which aren't inhabited. Now, I'm sure that this is dangerous aggression, but I'm sorry, I think I know something about aggression, and probably if you tried to figure out major aggressions in the world, you'd have a very hard time with that one. The Chinese have committed genocide in Tibet. It is the nastiest single thing that the Chinese have done. It is horrible. And it makes people who are sympathetic to the Chinese Revolution, like me originally, fiercely opposed to what the Chinese are doing. But if you take Chinese acts of conquest, when the US conquered, they say it was an aggression, the Chinese do, by North Korea, all the way up and fired missiles into China. Mao mobilized people to drive people back to the 38th parallel and restore North Korea, and stopped. When they had the border war with India, they conquered up to the place they claimed, and they stopped. So one of the points about this is that it is not obvious that the Chinese are the most aggressive power militarily, and they're trying, because they're choking in the big cities, to have green energy, and they're doing quite a lot about it. And if they are to be a successful power in the 21st century, they're going to have to work on economic development focused on green energy and solar panels and a bunch of other things, and not on war. And actually, some people in China have that idea pretty much. And the Dalai Lama's proposal to them is to remove the main thing which gives people the shivers about China, which is what they do in Tibet. So this is a pretty crucial point. The Dalai Lama has suggested this. It's very wise for China, but the Chinese leadership is too authoritarian, dogmatic, stupid, creepy, whatever you want to say, to actually, or the too American, I'm speaking of settler colonialism, to actually adapt to this. Now, the problem is that His Holiness is not Martin Luther King or Gandhi. He is not the leader of a mass nonviolent movement. And the situation in Dharamsala is that there are a number of very passionate people who come talk about, you know, we ought to fight for independence. We ought to do something to make the middle way have some life. We ought not to just sit on our hands. And for whatever reason, including that his staff isn't too big on furthering revolt, they ostracize such people if they speak out. And although everybody in Tibet wants independence, they do not use this as a vehicle for pressuring the Chinese. And I think this is a terrible mistake, and I think it's resulted in a lot of demoralization among the Tibetans, which doesn't have to be there. And people are fighting, from wearing white on Wednesdays inside Tibet for the Dalai Lama to self-immolation. But it's a very, very serious problem. And in terms of the future, I'm less worried about armed struggle there than I think there will be a continuing movement, than I am about the fact that to say that the Tibetans seek nonviolence and are compassionate toward the Chinese in the sense that they want the horror of the occupation healed and them to stop settling Han in Tibetan territory. But they do not want to kill the Chinese. To say that is not enough. There has to be a nonviolent movement. And I think this is the great problem of what will come after the Dalai Lama, although he amuses me very much, and I saw some women, monks, or nuns, excuse me, sparring while I was there. And they argue. Two of them stand up and they fling with their arms arguments at one who sits down and answers. And it's an old Tibetan monkish practice and has a lot of violence in it. It's just not that it culminates in hitting anybody. So the Dalai Lama says that he may be reborn a woman. And I think that's visionary on his part. But I hope that he also, and regardless of whether he does, that somebody does, talk about how to make the nonviolent movement more effective to bring down the crazy and harmful Chinese rule in Tibet.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. Deeply appreciate it. I think the 10 to 12 minute rule that I had for my colleagues applies to me as well. And I have looked at the watch, so I can assure you that I'll complete it in about 10 minutes. A couple points that I want to make. And that is about the implications of all that's happening in the world. And how has the international community responded to all that China did? Refresh your memory, 1950s and early 50s that Chinese came in after 49, that they had established their own rule in China, and then the aggression and invasion in Tibet. And I want to remind you that today, because China is seen as a very powerful country, that there are many countries around the world who are not willing even to talk with Dalai Lama. Give you two examples. Norway, where he got the Nobel Peace Prize. 25 years after that, and the 25th celebration anniversary. And he came to Norway, and the Prime Minister did not see him. And that is the only time that a Nobel laureate comes to Norway and the Prime Minister doesn't see him. And the reason for that, probably you know, is that just a year, 2 years before that, 3 years before that, Nobel Committee had given Nobel Peace Prize to Liu, one of those dissidents who had been given 11-year punishment, imprisonment for being that kind of dissident and on sedition charges. And after that, what happened? China retaliated. Norway's salmon from 92% to China went to 29%. And at the same time, what happened is that Chinese, they went even beyond that. They said that they are not going to give visa-free travel to Norwegians in China. Another example, and that I would give to you of Britain. You probably remember that Cameron had spoken with Dalai Lama, had welcomed Dalai Lama, and after that he had to cancel his own visit in 2013 to China. And the reason simply was that the Chinese leader said they are not going to see him. I was looking at the numbers. Dalai Lama met in 2001, 11 prime ministers and presidents as he traveled. 2013, only 2 met him. And I think the point that I want to make is that at the beginning, when China took over Tibet, Jawaharlal Nehru was the Prime Minister in India, and he did not take a stand. And he did ask even the United States to be quiet. All these uprisings that happened after that, 2008, 1959, and nobody took any action, nobody talked about it. At the present time, China's suzerainty, China's rule over Tibet is accepted by the international community. Well, what is the answer? You probably have again seen that they have got their fake Panchen Lama, that they are the ones who have said in China that their council must approve on reincarnation. And the Dalai Lama has said now that doesn't have to be the next Dalai Lama born in China, or doesn't have to be a little child. And so I think my 2 colleagues who have raised the question, what is going to happen after Dalai Lama goes? Because China has been waiting for it. All these efforts that Claude mentioned, that years and years and years of totally useless efforts in a way, useless in terms of the outcome, but a great deal of effort made for reconciliation, and that reconciliation has gone nowhere. That middle way is the only way. I think I'm so glad that Claude worked on it, that Alan has spoken eloquently about it, and that I hope is the answer at the present time. I think the international community is not going to take a stand. I think the United States is not going to take a stand. The United States simply has always said, one time, as you probably remember, that the United States did help or did want to have people who were in that uprising to assist them. But then the realization has grown that it's not going to work. Very briefly, just a minute about India. India's relations with China, Claude is absolutely right. They are not going to improve until this China-Tibet issue is settled. On the northwest side, as you probably know, that China's incursions have continued in Ladakh. On the northeast side, they simply ask and they say that the Indian part, and that is Arunachal Pradesh, that is the northeast part, and China calls it southern Tibet. And so there are problems there also. In the last couple of years, there have been many incursions, but unless that issue is settled, India's relations with China cannot improve. So internationally at this stage, what China has done in Tibet, no country seems to be willing to take a stand on it. Alan talked about the South China Sea and East China Sea and what they are doing in those islands. And I think those who are in international law know that under the UN Law of the Sea Convention, if you have an island, then 200 miles around that is the special zone, economic zone, and all the resources in that belong to you. And that is what China at the present time is doing. And also, I think, as you probably know, China feels very strongly that by 2050, its own navy should be the one that should rule all over the world. And so at this stage, Alan is right, it's not that aggression, but I think South China Sea and East China Sea, they are important issues. But I think this issue, Tibet, is more important than that. And I hope that the international community can at least put pressure upon China. And that middle way and reconciliation, that effort at the present time has totally stalled because China feels that Dalai Lama is going to go, and after that we'll be able to settle the whole issue on our own terms. I hope that that doesn't take place. I hope that the United States can see that Tibet issue is as important in terms of peace, in terms of stability in the region, as probably, or even more important than the South China Sea, where at the present time we are putting a great deal of pressure. So I want to stop here. I have taken 12 minutes. Thank you very much. May I ask all these three people as they come in, I want you to especially join me in thanking and in applauding John Gaudette. He's the one who put it all together. He's the one who made the effort along with them, working very, very closely and dearly with Anne, and also the center. So, thank you. And I'll take one more seat. Please come on up. And the point is that we won't take too long. And gourmet caviar and champagne is coming from France and Russia. So,
But it's been held under traffic.
held up.
Roll the turnpike.
And if you don't, I think I'll just take this chair. So, any comments, any questions? Yeah. Good. Come on in. And
I want to request that everybody please speak into a microphone so we can capture all of this.
So kindly, any comments, questions? And it's not simply questions, any comments. You have probably, many of you have followed the situation. And if you want to make any comments or make any questions, Madam Chair, is that all right? I'm given permission.
I'll ask a question of you and anybody else here. It seems that, I don't know how many of you are familiar, some of you may be in the audience, with the concept of the string of pearls, the Chinese string of pearls, that is of deep concern to India. You can see why if you look at the map, and it becomes somewhat apparent that Tibet was the first pearl in creating, and if you look at it, it is a control of the Indian Ocean and now the China Sea. So that this is, if you step back and you go, well, this is part of a very brilliant long-term strategy. And we have a short vision, right, in the United States. And so the idea of waiting out 50 or 75 years for someone like the Dalai Lama to move on, as you put it, I like that euphemism, Ved. But it seems to be part of a much bigger picture. I think, John, you asked me some specific questions about torture and whatnot, and I gave you a kind of a snarky answer about the international community's response to, or China's response to the international community's criticism of their use of torture and whatnot. My response was, nothing, right? Because we had the opportunity back in the 50s, and we've lost the opportunity. But I think that we have a lack of capacity because we have such a short view, just like election cycles in the United States, whereas Beijing has a very long view. And I was in India the day I think that India was taking charge of its first aircraft carrier, and that the only reason they were spending all that money to get an aircraft carrier was to have something in opposition to the string of pearls. So this is a much bigger. This is part of a much bigger picture with a long view, which if you think about the Chinese civilization and the Han civilization, makes sense. So this is just a blip. This problem, from the Chinese perspective, I think Tibet is a blip, is a momentary problem of a people that, quite frankly, from the Han perspective, getting back to that, they think are still savages. I'll give you an example. After Tiananmen Square, I was fortunate enough to be in Massachusetts in the center that had been in communication with the Tiananmen Square protesters. And for some reason, we had faxes going back and forth. And so many of the Tiananmen Square protesters, when those were able to flee China, first came to us. And I had an extraordinary chance to have a conversation, because all these young people had put their lives on the line to protect, for civil liberties and human rights and freedom of expression. So, needless to say, the first question I asked them was about Tibet. And what I got back was really rather remarkable, because there was a mix. Most of them were Han, but there were Uyghurs, there were Mongolians, and others who were there. Those who, from, quote, the other minorities, the other members of the family, all thought that Tibet should be independent, right, at the very least, or full autonomy at the very least. Not one of the Han students, the same Han students who were willing to put their lives in jeopardy for their own civil liberties, when it came to the question of Tibet, thought, oh no, not Tibet. Tibet is not ready. They need, and this is a quote, another 75 years of civilization by us before they're ready for self-governance. So there's an attitude problem that is rather extensive, because if Beijing and the Han still consider the Tibetans to be, in a sense, savages in the way that we consider Native Americans, I mean, it has a very similar feel to it, I think, between Western Europeans coming through the United States and our attitude towards Native Americans, and how the Han feel about Tibet. So I'm often reminded that this is, now I know this many years later, this is part of a much bigger picture.
I should mention to you, 3 weeks ago I was in India, and I had the opportunity, I know her a little, but opportunity to be with the Foreign Minister of India, Sushma Swaraj.
And I'm glad that you asked that question, because we were talking about it and China came up, because at that time the incursions in both the northeast and northwest had stopped, but the fear was, and the concern was, that that is not something that will stop, it will continue. And I asked her about South China Sea, where India has been also saying that freedom of navigation is important. And I think the reason why I talk about it is that law of the sea, and especially that area, I've done some work on it. And at the present time, what China is doing is, they do want, Alan is right about their own energy, but what Claude has mentioned about these pearls, look around, I think you can just think about the geography, and then I'll go back to Sushma Swaraj. But what has happened is that from Nepal and the Indian Ocean to Pakistan, all around, then over Nepal, Burma, and that is where India feels that China is at the present time surrounding and using that pearl kind of idea to see that India is contained totally. And I think on that issue, as I asked her South China Sea, she started talking about this entire kind of encirclement. And then she said that we are concerned about it, that we have talked with the United States, and United States and India have been working together on this particular issue and on navigation. And I know that Alan is appropriately concerned about the US policies as well, but I think at the present time, Chinese efforts in that part, and not simply it's Vietnam, not simply it's Taiwan, not simply it is Philippines, but all those countries along with Japan are very, very concerned, as all these countries have met as, you know, Southeast Asian nations, and Obama has hosted them. That issue again has arisen. And I don't know the answer to it, Claude, but certainly it's a long-term kind of operation on the part of China.
Something
if I could, oh.
I was just going to remind people that they should go to the microphones and ask questions, but please join in while they're making their way.
No, but you say it.
So, I think that if you look at the cross-party affection for Manifest Destiny, which is not much taught here, that is to say the genocide going all the way to the Philippines in the War of 1898, you may begin to take seriously that America is also a great power, is often a nasty great power. I'm very fond of Barack Obama, but I'm not at all sure that the pivot toward Asia is being made in a way which is very conscious of how to deal with these things, and that may be partly the problem that Claude refers to. But I think that this effort to make of Tibet a buffer would be a huge step toward achieving a more peaceful arrangement. Maybe I could just add something. After 2008, Barack went and he went to India and he sold a lot of weapons. And he went to Saudi Arabia and he sold 65 billion, if I remember. Some huge amount of weapons, right? And if you look at what a fight it was to have any kind of opening to Iran and any kind of balancing in the Middle East against the reactionary policies of Israel and Saudi Arabia, it was very hard. You will begin to get the idea that this China is the total danger, and we have to be a big fan of, let's see, arming the Hindu government of India, right? I think that it would be good to think out very clearly that, yeah, the Chinese are pressing, and there are all these border things. On the other hand, I will just say it again. As far as I know, China hasn't invaded anybody straight up since the revolution. And other people have attacked them. And if you talk about trying to get them into the international community, yeah, they're a great power and they're very angry, very humiliated. But if you want to get them into the international community in a civilized way, unless we think through, I mean, let me put it to you another way. I would just say, I remember the Opium Wars. That was when Britain brought opium to China to drug it, right? I remember in SDS, somebody got up on the stage when we were talking about drugs and said, you know, British imperialists brought drugs to China and the communists kicked them out. And it made a big impression on me, I'll tell you, because I hadn't thought of it that way. I think if we don't rethink how to approach the Chinese and how to deal with the Chinese, that we run grave dangers of war. And I won't get entirely political, but I will say one thing about Hillary and the Barack efforts to push against Russia and to push NATO into the Ukraine and so on. Putin is a nasty guy, but that was not a smart effort. And we can do the same thing with China, and we'll produce war.
It's all about politics.
Just in
the bigger picture, but is relevant, how do you feel possibly about the Chinese economy, which is probably worse than what we're all hearing? And what impact will that be in China's operations day in and day out? Factories are closing on the shoreline. There's just, the economy's worse than what we're hearing. So where do you see that impacting everything?
That's a very good question. In what I know, I think that's part of the momentum in this one belt, one road policy is going over the borders, partly to find outlets for overproduction. And as we were talking about the exploitation of natural resources in Tibet and other Western provinces, they haven't run it dry, but a gross translation of the Chinese term for Tibet, Xizang, is Western treasure house, right? The fount of all of Asia's great rivers. Innumerable valuable mineral deposits, huge virgin forests, you name it. Now, if we look towards green energy, great potential for wind, solar, geothermal, others. But the Chinese economy is much more precarious than people tend to admit, and certainly what we hear from Beijing. And I think it's manifesting in this outward view from Beijing to both in a string of pearls context, but also in these new economic treaties and alliances through the region.
I think instead of our speaking, kindly speak and at the end. And I had promised some of you that we'll conclude at 7:30, and then it's a very intimate kind of gathering, and we can probably just simply mill around and talk with each other. So I have a couple comments, and then we'll conclude it.
Okay, I just wanted to ask about religion again. I lived in China in the northeast in Harbin, and I did visit a few Buddhist temples there, and I was it's very far away from Tibet though, so I just want to quickly ask, is there major differences between Han Chinese Buddhist and Tibetan Buddhist? And I'll take my question sitting down.
Well, I wanted to bring that up as we're talking about engagements with China and trying to, we need to deconstruct sort of this monolithic notion of China. And what's a really growing and sizable movement right now in China are Han Chinese converting to Tibetan Buddhism. And in my view, and at risk of sounding like a Chinese apologist, which I certainly am not, we need to talk about how one of the key actors here in working through the Tibet problem is China needs to save Tibet, right? If there is a civil movement from, a grassroots civil social society that is engaged with Tibetan Buddhism, that shows great promise. There's a huge popularity right now of Chinese pilgrimage to Tibet. And part of it is, as Claude pointed out, is this notion of the Wild West in it. So it's a sort of reverse Orientalism of Han Chinese going there and sort of perpetuating the romantic myths of it. But there's also a very true and compassionate and legitimate pursuit of the wisdom traditions that have proliferated on the plateau. And while Chinese Buddhism and Tibetan Buddhism both have the same roots in Indian Buddhism, they're starkly different. But today, these movements of pilgrims, there's young people that are young Han Chinese that are backpacking through China the same way that Europeans and North Americans and others have in decades past. And they're sincerely interested in Tibet. And they may or may not have an opportunity to learn what has truly happened in Tibet over the past 50, 60 years, because the Great Firewall really is a great firewall. But information will spread. And I see great possibility in that.
I would agree with that. I've seen this really fascinating. Is this working? Doesn't matter. I can speak loudly. As my students know, I also have watched this interesting phenomena of this fascination, and there's a positive side, which is this reestablishment of this ancient priest-patron sensibility that has always gone on, and sometimes controversial, trying to figure out the history between Tibet, the Dalai Lamas, and all the previous and the other lineages with various rulers in China. But it also has the aspect of sometimes I feel like a fad, of course. It is certainly financially really beneficial to a number of Tibetan lamas. There's a business aspect of it. I'm certainly hoping that what will happen was that this will improve, this will instill maybe that very same, that what you said about that, a younger generation. But we all had real hope, quite frankly, of this new generation of Chinese who had been educated in the West would have this wonderful new way because somehow they came to here and they picked up Western democratic ideals. And it turned out to be just the opposite. The younger generation is more nationalistic than their parents and grandparents, seemingly. And you know, many of us have sort of looked at how did that happen? Well, it's because, let's be honest, Chinese students come to the United States and they don't take liberal arts, they're taking computer classes and they stay amongst themselves and they just go back with their US degrees. Yeah, well, I mean, it's great on the one hand, but what we had this false hope that this new generation that were Chinese that were not being educated in the Soviet Union, but now the United States and Western Europe would then have more liberal attitudes towards. So I don't think that I see any more liberal attitudes towards Tibetans and Tibet, but this maybe there's a spark there with this renewed fascination with Tibetan Buddhism.
I think your point is a very good one, and I think a way of looking at it is the following. The Chinese leadership depend on economic growth, rapid economic growth. They are going down. There will be a Chinese spring. That means that also there are quite large possibilities in the next 5, 10, 15 years for a Tibetan spring. So I think this is a very large and hopeful point about it. Maybe after you ask your question, I say something.
Before you do that, one more thing, footnote, and that is that within the last 5 years, twice having taken American students to Dharamshala, we had the opportunity to be with His Holiness. Catherine and I were together for about an hour with him and talked about many issues. I won't go into it, but before that, I had spoken with him on this reconciliation part and China part, and I had, in a provocative way, said, China is not willing to talk, China is not willing to do anything. And the Dalai Lama said to me, you just wait. He said, at this stage, my message, simply of love and compassion and dialogue, he said, you don't know, but in China, there is a growing feeling that that is the right answer to do. So he said, in China, in time to come, it's going to be useful to continue with that, and it's going to work. So I simply want to share that with you.
I have two questions. First, I want to compare American and China. When we talk about Tibetan issues, I want to say, think about a question. If some local person lived in Colorado want to make Colorado to be a state, think about what the United States American will do. That's the first question. The second question is that I think Dalai Lama is a religious leader. She should do something in church. Think about if some pastor of Denver told President Obama, you should do this, you should do that. I want to govern Colorado. What's the government of American should do? That's two questions. Okay.
I think I'm going to ask John to respond to them, and then after that we can simply chat. I think thank you for saying that, and you know, all views are expressed and appropriately, and this is a free country.
Okay, so this is the microphone that wasn't working before, but I don't think I have the lungs that collect this, so I'll rely on the microphone. And I think it's an important question, it's something to keep in mind, but it's also look at the consequences if you compare the United States and China. But even if you want to step back from the comparison, human rights records should stand on their own. So Alan is completely right to criticize the United States for our human rights record, for all of the things we've done. But that doesn't mean that it's excusable for other countries to do it. And when they point to that, and that's, you know, the US has done an awful lot of bad things, and bad governments like pointing to that, and fairly so. But that doesn't mean that it's something that necessarily should be viewed as an excuse. And in the United States, the general response to people who call for independence, be they Texans or Hawaiians, is to ignore them. And that's what we do because we're not worried that they're going to secede. And I think there is a legitimate concern. There have been people who said, I think the Chinese are, again, very good at finding quotes from Tibetans saying, we're going to use the middle way to put one foot in Tibet and kick the Chinese out with the other. And there are concerns about Tibet looking for independence despite the Dalai Lama and the middle way and all of that. And the reason those are concerns is because Tibetans have been denied rights. And I think particularly the second panel looked at very big pictures. And one of the things that we do at the Tibetan Center for Human Rights and Democracy is we look at individual human rights. We're not arguing for independence or middle way. We're not talking much about self-determination. We're talking about if somebody's walking down the street shouting slogans, they have a right to do that under international law. And if someone's detained, they have a right to an attorney. They have a right to a fair trial. And those little steps are the things that I think culminate in the bigger problems, and they add up. So I don't know if that entirely answers your question. I'm happy to talk later, but we are running out of time. So thank you.
I feel awkward, but this is a wonderful, intimate gathering, and I think I would like for you to kindly join me in thanking everybody, and especially John Gaudette. Conversation can continue as long as you please, and I think I'm so sorry that today, because of this traffic problem, we don't have the champagne and we stuck on it. But